In this video, you will learn about the 4 flowchart types to use for continuous improvement in your business. Hello and welcome to our ongoing series of compliance webinars presented by Mango. That's me, Craig Thornton. I'm one of the owners here at Mango. So this is what we're going to cover today. Just go through an introduction why I thought about doing this webinar. Then we'll get into why we use flowcharts. What does a flowchart do, and how do you do flowcharts? And then we'll get stuck into the meat of the webinar, which are the 4 types of flowchart that you need to use. And you don't need to use anything else other than those 4, from my opinion. Through the middle of this year, we did a big survey, and we surveyed a whole lot of compliance people around the world, 20 or so countries, and 250 people responded, which is quite gratifying. And inside of that survey, we asked all sorts of different questions, and we came out with sort of 6 insights. So the insights that we came up with, we created this ISO Insights report. I'm just going to talk about 2 of those insights. If you want to have a look at the detail of that report, just go onto that link there. So the 2 insights were, firstly, we found that people were getting most value out of their compliance system if they focused in on business improvements, rather than focusing on updating policies or making your spreadsheets look nice and pretty. If people stopped focusing on compliance and focused on business improvement, they were more satisfied with their compliance system, which sort of led into the second one. If you spend more time on making business improvements to your systems, then you're going to reduce the time for compliance. So if compliance is taking up a lot of your time, stop doing that. Focus on business improvements, because you'll find that over time your compliance activity will actually be reduced. So today's presentation comes care of the Memory Jogger 2. So started doing this stuff in the late 80s through the 90s. So back then was a book called Memory Jogger and Memory Jogger 2, and these are the best tools that you can use for doing any business improvements, any quality improvements, and they've been around for years. So back when I was at Tate Electronics, we bought 30 Memory Jogger 2 pocket books to hand out to various staff members to tell them the tools and techniques for business improvement. So we've been doing this a few years, and today's presentation comes care of that. But also in the Memory Jogger, the other types of tools. So when you're working with different ideas, this is explanations on how you do each of these different activities. If you're working with numbers, check sheets, control charts, histograms, Paretos, run charts, scatter diagrams. And then if you're working with people and teams, then they've got advice in that book around how to run meetings, how to run projects, starting teams and things like that. So highly recommend that you get that book. And to get that book is just jump on the web. You can download it, or you can get electronic versions through Gold QPC, or you can get paperback versions. You can get them through Amazon. I think the ones in Amazon I looked out this morning were like $7 or $8. So cheap as chips. I think that one from Gold QPC is like $30. So they're very cheap and well worth getting a copy yourself. Why do we use flowcharts? So when you're making business improvements, and when I've worked in industry, and I'm still doing that as a consultant now, and we actually used flowcharts yesterday at a consulting company I worked with. What it does, it identifies the actual flow or sequence of events in a process that any product or service follows, and you use symbols to represent each step. So I think everybody knows what a flowchart is, but that's sort of the official definition of what it actually does. So what you're looking at is actual flows and sequences of either a product or a service, and you're trying to use symbols to represent each step. So the one I was talking about yesterday with a client, and we'll talk about in a lot more detail coming up, which is Kiwi Labels, was their job card flow or their job bag flow. But you can work it for any type of process, any flow of materials, when you're making a sale, you're servicing a product, any type of customer service process, any type of process you can use a flowchart to. So what does a flowchart actually do? So what is the power of a flowchart? Well, firstly, it displays, or can display, complexity or unexpected complexity. So that's what we found yesterday when I was with a client. We would with Kiwi Labels, we mapped the process and we found a whole lot of complexity at the start of the process, which once you put it down on paper and agreed with the client, it highlighted that complexity very quickly. It also highlights problem areas where there could be a build-up of stock, or it could be a build-up of waste. Any redundancy, so stuff that you're doing that you don't need to do, and you could move it out. You could get stuck in various loops. But I think the most powerful thing is that you can find in a flowchart where you can simplify things and standardize things. So a flowchart will display simplified and standardized processes quite easily, quite quickly. So that's the first one. Secondly, flowcharts, you can use them to compare and contrast what actually happened versus what the ideal is. So maybe the ideal could be written in your policies and procedures, or it could be written on the wall. But what actually happened? So when you map it out, you could see, so this is what actually happened. One thing that I maybe 2 weeks ago, I attended a webinar on how to do investigations differently, which was part of sort of safety differently. And they had an interesting methodology that you could think about when you're doing flowcharts, is you can describe the work as it's intended to do. So maybe that's what's intended to do a particular job. That could be the ideal. Then what do people normally do when they do that job? So when someone turns up at work and they normally do that job, it's not as intended, but this is what they normally do. So it may be slightly different. You may want to map that. So that's sort of like the ideal versus the actual. But there's actually a third one, which is what was actually done at a particular moment in time. So for example, if you have an investigation and an accident has occurred, or a major non-conformance has occurred, or something's gone wrong, there's three. There's what's intended, what's normally done, and then you could map it as what was actually done in the process. So maybe something was missed, or a particular stage was skipped over. So you can do the flowcharts for each of those three to highlight gaps, and then work on what those gaps are, and maybe improve your processes because there's a gap there. So that's where you can, that's the second one, where you can actually compare ideal with what's actually happening. There's a third one. So as a team, you sort of map out your processes in the flowchart. You can come to some sort of agreement amongst the team, or amongst whoever you're working with, on the steps and how those steps affect process performance. So you're getting an agreement, you're getting everybody to view it with the same eyes or the same lenses, and you can see, well, we could change this, or we could do this to improve our process performance. So that's another use of flowcharts. Another good one is, and this is what we did when we were at Tate Electronics, we did a big project and looked at a particular process line and flowcharted it. And we worked out, and we could identify, well, we actually needed to measure more things at certain points in the process to be able to get a better understanding of process performance. So we mapped the processes, and then we said, right, no, we're going to collect data here, and then we're going to collect data here. And from that data, we'll make some decisions and some judgments. So you can use flowcharts to identify where additional data may be collected, and you can do some proper investigations. So a flowchart allows you to do that. Flowcharts can be used as training aids to understand the whole process. Obviously, flowcharts can be used in maybe your health and safety manual or your quality manual or your integrated management manual. You can use flowcharts in those types of things as maybe a training aid. So those are the 5 uses of a flowchart. So how do you do flowcharts? How do you actually do this sort of stuff? So again, it's a systematic process. And as I say, I was doing this yesterday. You know, I've been doing this for 30 years and I'm still doing the same stuff, so it still works. So first of all, you've got to map out the boundaries of the process. So where does the process start and where does it finish? So if you're going to map it, you've got to work out what are the boundaries, sort of what's the scope you're going to look at. So what are the input and what are the outputs? And then what sort of detail are we going to put in between? And we'll get into a little bit more detail again about that as we go through. So you've got to work out where it starts, where it stops, and what sort of detail do we actually need to be able to see where our problems are or where the gaps are. Starting simple, so make sure you start simple, and we'll go through this in once we start looking at the 4 types, because I've built those up into complexity. Start with a simple flowchart and build complexity over time. Don't start complex and try and stay complex. Start very basic, very simple, and then build complexity over time as your understanding grows. Okay, so step 2, so now you've worked out the boundaries. Determine the steps, and so you do that with brainstorming. So, and what you're doing is you're brainstorming activities that are done in the process. You're looking at what's coming in, the inputs to that process, and then you're looking at the outputs. And I think most importantly, from what I've done over the years, is you're looking at all the decision points or the QC checks, maybe where a quality control check is done, or you're measuring a temperature, or you're measuring a length or a distance, or you're measuring a color, or you're measuring viscosity, or you're measuring something that you're making a decision on. So you basically just put them all on post-it notes or just on a whiteboard. Just list down all the different activities that you do and brainstorm it and get maybe a team of people together and come up with all of those activities that you do to do the job. Don't worry about the sequence yet. That's coming up next. All you're doing is just brainstorming all the different ideas. And then you sequence the steps. So you put the steps into the particular order and you sequence, and you're trying to match what the actual process is. If you're wanting to do the ideal, that's no trouble, but mostly when I'm using flowcharts, I'm just trying to sequence the actual process from start to finish. From the brainstorm, you then put them in order, and using post-it notes, it's easy on a board or on a wall, and you put them into that particular order. From that sequence, you can now draw a flowchart, and so there's lots of ideas and different symbols you can use, but I think box, diamond, and arrow, that's all you need. So the first one is the box or a rectangle, which shows a particular task or activity. And the rule here, and my rule is, multiple arrows can come into a box, but the rule is only one arrow leaves that box. If you've got multiple arrows coming out of a box, then that's not an activity box, that's a decision box. Have multiple arrows coming out, then it's definitely not an activity box. It's one of these. It's a decision box, whether it's a yes, no, pass, fail. So it's easy. So when you're looking at a particular flowchart and you glance at the flowchart and you can see lots of decisions being made, then for me, that's a problem. I'm thinking, wow, there's a lot of decisions being made here. Can we do this differently so we don't have to make so many decisions? Can we use poka-yoke, or can we use any other techniques to maybe drive down the number of decisions that staff are having to make? And of course, an arrow. And then the arrow defines the direction of the flow. So that's all you need: a box, rectangle, a diamond, and an arrow. That's all you need. And we'll talk about the different types of how those are actually used a little bit a bit later and show you some examples. So the next one is now you test it for completeness. So you've drawn up you've had a first go at it and you've drawn it up. Right, so now is this workable? Are the symbols used correctly? Like I said, if something's a rectangle and it's got more than one arrow coming out of it, then that doesn't look right. That doesn't seem right. So you need to have a look at that. Are the activity boxes, are they described clearly? Do other people understand it? So maybe get some other people to have a look at it. If there's any feedback loops, so when you come to a decision and it goes off somewhere, does it feed back into the line? Does it stop there? You make sure, or does it feed forward? You need to have a look at all the feedback loops. Do they get all closed off? There's that rule again, only one output arrow per activity box. There's that decision diamond. And then validate the flowchart with people who actually carry out those actions. So, if you draw it up on the whiteboard and maybe get the workers in from the shop floor or wherever they are, get them to validate. Now you can finalize it, and so you need to sort of sit down. Is the process that we're using now, does that actually match what we've flowcharted? And are people following that process? So that's as part of maybe your audit process. Once you've got this in place, now's the time to look at these complexities. And like we said before, it displays complexities and redundancies and loops and waste and whatnot. So now's it's probably one of the best tools for identifying gaps in your systems and opportunities for improvement. So it's used up right at the start of the process to look at your current situation and highlight these complexities. So I don't think flowcharts actually resolve issues. I don't think it's the root cause analysis type tool. It's just identifying where gaps are so that you can use other tools maybe to look at root cause analysis and understand where the value may be getting lost for customers, and maybe look at value mapping later on. Look at the current process from the ideal and look at that gap. So this is what the ideal is. So I viewed an interesting video the other day from Greg Smith out of Perth, and he was talking about this is a safety issue where most companies, when they go to court, the court decides what is the ideal process, or what's the agreed process for a particular risk, then what actually happened to cause that accident, and what was the departure away from that ideal process. So a flowchart is ideal for displaying what the actual process is as opposed to the ideal process. So, two flowcharts, and you can see what happened, what caused that accident. And he was saying that most cases where fines are in play, where companies get fined by the authorities, is people don't know what the ideal process was, and we're following a different process, maybe something that was agreed amongst themselves that's completely different from the ideal. So flowcharts are an excellent way of maybe when you're out auditing and looking at the processes and seeing, so the ideal is this, but they're following this. There's a big gap there. So, draw that ideal against what's actually happening and see what the gaps are. Here are the 4 types of the flowchart, types of flowcharts that you can use. The macro flowchart. So the macro flowchart this is what I did yesterday with one of our clients, is you're doing a very high level process flow. So in this particular case, this is Kiwi labels, and this is the actual flowchart that we created. Just look at a very macro level, how do they do their operation? So they receive an order, they do some pre-press stuff around proofing and artwork and plates and dies and things like that. Then it goes off to the printing machine to get printed, and then it gets finished. After that, it may get a secondary application, maybe some extra rewind. Maybe the reel is around the wrong way, so they have to rewind it, or it needs to go through some extra checks, or it needs to be embossed. So there's different finishing processes, and then finally it gets dispatched. So that's a macro flowchart. It may be down or sideways. It's just very basic. It's just very broad overview, and really it's just sort of setting the scene, and why you would use it is just sort of, it gets a broad agreement maybe in a group of people in a meeting room, or maybe out on the shop floor, just to get a clear understanding of what's actually happening, and inside of that you can start debating some of the details. And maybe at this very high level there might be some glaring gaps that may be missing flowchart. The second one is a top down, so it's basically the same. So they receive the order, they do some artwork, they print it, they finish it, and then they deliver it. You go into a bit more detail. So inside of receiving the order, you get requests for quotes, there's inwards goods involved, they prepare a job bag, and there's some planning and some scheduling going on at that first stage. The second stage, the artwork is done, a proof is prepared, and a proof is accepted. So they create a mock of the label, they send it away to the client, and the client accepts it. And from that acceptance, they then create some plates and some dies, and they specify what the label is going to be. Once they've got that information, they then create a job bag, and so the printers get a job bag, they get a production folder. That's how you set up the machine, and then you find your inks and your plates and your dies, and then the machine is set up and then it's run. So that's that process. And then in the finishing area, they also get a job bag and a production folder, and they get the dies and the rewind and this machine, and they run that as well. And then in delivery, there's a pick list, dispatch notes, there's box labels, and there's invoicing. So that's a top down. So running along the top is the overall process, and underneath are a list of all the activities that you need to do. This is just, there's more information, obviously, there's more detail to go into. I'm just giving you this as sort of a very high level just to explain what a top-down flowchart is. What this is doing is just giving you a broad understanding, again, with a little bit more detail than the first type, just to give you a breakdown of what's actually happening. It doesn't do the QC stuff, which is more important. So that's in the next two flowcharts that hopefully you'll see where the QC checks are made, because the next two are the main ones that I look into. Type 3 is a deployment flowchart. Now these can be drawn all sorts of different ways. This one's called a swim lane. You can do other types. You can do top-down flowchart, but really you're separating out responsibilities. So in this case, it's separating out departments, but you could separate out individuals, or you could separate out worker titles, or you separate the responsibilities into each area. So for example, the process for creating a label starts with customer service, where they receive the order, they do a quote, they send it off for acceptance. If it's not accepted, then it stops. But if it is accepted, then it goes down into the pre-press people who do all the artwork, they do all the job bag, production folder, and they do the planning. Once that's done, then the job goes off to the print department for setup. They run the job, and there's various checks that are done along the way, and if the checks are good, then it goes off to the finishing department who run the job. Checks are made, finally into dispatch. The check, if it's all good, product goes into store, and then it's picked and delivered. So that's a deployment type flowchart, very popular. I've seen a ton of those when I've been auditing, and I think you can sort of see pretty clearly where the QC checks are made, because you can see the diamonds there. I'm not displaying all the information there. This is just for part of this webinar, so you can all see. There could be other checks along the way that are in play that I'm not displaying here, but it's very, very quickly you can see where a check is made and then it moves off to the next department. A check is made, it's moved off to the next department. A check is made, it's moved off to the next department. So when you're moving things between departments, then things can go wrong. So is that check right? Is it not right? What other information do they need to do to be able to make a good check? Are they trained? Are they competent? So again, with a deployment flowchart, you can look at that. You can use it for auditing. You can use it for looking at gaps. So yeah, it's a good methodology for a flowchart. And the final one is the one that's most popular, the one that I use the most, is the workflow flowchart. So this is their actual, I've copied this from their system. This is their actual process that they use when they're producing a job. So it's going to be 2 slides because I couldn't fit it all on 1 slide so you could see it. But as you can see, they've actually got another symbol there. This is their flowchart they create themselves. They've got a big stop button there to say that the process actually stops if the quote isn't accepted. And Prism, if you understand what Prism is their ERP system. An order is received from a customer, then a LOF or a request for quote, LOF form is presented, then it's sent out electronically to the customer who accepts it online and approves the quote online. And then once that's in play, then a job bag is done with the LOF, the quote, the production folder, and a spec. And then that then goes off into planning and scheduling, where they order some PM module, production scheduling module, there's stock taking, there's daily production meetings, and then off to the left there, inwards goods and raw materials. So you can see activity and a diamond, activity and a diamond. So as we scroll down, a diamond, it's a big decision. Another decision, another decision. So there's lots of decisions being made through that pre-press process to make sure things are right. If you get something wrong up here and you print that label, then that costs thousands and thousands if they get that wrong. So they put a lot of effort into making sure pre-press is done. But as you can see, it's a bunch of activity boxes with diamonds representing decision points, and it's the decision points you should be focusing on when you're making your business improvements. Where are those things that occur that could cause us issues? So the macro is just a very overview type, a top-down, which has the same as the macro, but in more detail with a top-down process. Then there's the deployment. And then finally, the workflow flowchart. So when I'm consulting or when I'm doing any business process stuff, my most popular one is the last one, the type 4, which is the workflow flowchart. And what I'm doing is I'm mapping the ideal process, and then I'm mapping the actual process and looking at where are those gaps, what's causing issues. I'm looking at complexity, I'm looking at redundancy, I'm looking at where wastage is. And so as our example yesterday was, the problem is when you're producing a label, the customer comes and says, I want this label here. And so you go, right, I'll create a proof for you. So away you go, and you go into your art software, artwork software, whatever it is, Photoshop, you create that label and you create it as a proof, and then you give it to the customer, and the customer looks at it and says, oh yeah, that's okay. And they sign off that proof, and then that proof, then accepted proof, is then goes to the machine. The machine produces that, print machine produces that label, gets distributed, sent out, and then the customer gets the label, and the label isn't what the label they wanted in the first place was. And so there was a breakdown at the proofing area there. So we mapped out the proofing process to try and work out, well, the customer wants this, but the proof isn't exactly what the customer's wanting. And then from that proof, the production doesn't quite match either. So there was a whole long discussion about how can we improve the proofing process to make sure that the customer gets exactly what they want to get. So we mapped it out and flowcharted it and worked out on the processes, what processes we could improve. And from that, they're now going off and writing a new standard operating procedure for the pre-press. So the pre-press processes, standard operating procedure is getting a complete rewrite, and that whole process is being completely redone. And once that comes back, then we'll sit down again and go through that standard operating procedure. So, you know, these problems directly affecting customers, the easiest and best way to find out what's going wrong is to map out and flowchart what the ideal is versus what's actually happening and looking at those gaps. And it's the first thing you should do when you're looking at your business improvements is map the ideal versus mapping the actual, and looking at gaps and resolving and putting in corrective actions on those gaps. If you enjoyed that video, why not click on this link here to view other business improvement webinars.